How the World War I disaster changed the world forever. The world did not collapse in a single moment. There was no instant where everything changed at once, no clear signal that history was about to fracture. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, a world that believed it was stable. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at the height of its power. Empires stretched across continents. Technology was advancing. Cities were growing. There was confidence, even optimism, that progress was unstoppable. But beneath that surface, something was building. Tensions that were never resolved. Rivalries disguised as diplomacy. Alliances that promised protection, but quietly prepared for war. Each nation believed it understood the balance of power. Each leader believed they could control what came next. And that belief was the first mistake, because history rarely breaks where we expect it to. It breaks where pressure has been ignored for too long. What makes this story unsettling is not just what happened, but how unnoticed it was at the time. People lived their lives. Markets opened. Conversations continued. The world moved forward as if nothing was about to change. And yet it was already changing. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. By the time the first crisis appeared, it was no longer a question of if something would happen, only how far it would go. And that is where this story begins. The moment before everything changed. Before the war, there was a fragile calm that looked like stability. Nations were not at peace. They were simply waiting. Across Europe, empires stood powerful but uneasy. Germany was rising fast, determined to secure its place in a world already dominated by older powers. Britain watched closely, protective of its naval supremacy. France carried the memory of past defeat, waiting for an opportunity to restore its position. Russia expanded, vast and unpredictable, driven by ambition and fear at the same time. On the surface, diplomacy held everything together. Treaties were signed, alliances were formed. Agreements created the illusion that conflict could be contained, that any crisis would be managed through negotiation. But these alliances were not stabilizing the system. They were tightening it. Each agreement connected nations in ways that made any conflict more dangerous. A dispute between two countries could quickly pull in others. A single decision could trigger a chain reaction. And beneath all of this, there was something even more volatile. National pride. A belief in strength, in honor, in the necessity of proving power. War was not yet feared in the way it would later become. For many, it was still seen as a tool, a way to resolve tension, to assert dominance, to shape the future. That belief created a dangerous confidence. Because when leaders believe they can control the outcome, they are more willing to take risks. And risks, in a system this connected, do not stay contained. They spread. So the world moved forward, unaware that the conditions for disaster were already in place. Not because no one saw the danger, but because no one believed it would go that far. The assassination that unlocked a chain reaction. The event itself did not look like the beginning of a world war. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was, at first, a political shock. A violent act, yes. A serious crisis, certainly. But not something that should have ignited a global catastrophe. Incidents like this had happened before. Empires had faced unrest. Leaders had been targeted. Diplomacy had always found a way to contain the damage. That was the expectation. That was the pattern everyone believed would repeat itself. But this time, the system reacted differently. Austria-Hungary did not just seek justice. It sought to assert control. Serbia did not simply comply. It resisted, and behind each of them stood larger powers, bound by alliances that had been designed for protection, but now began to act like triggers. Decisions started to accelerate. Ultimatums were issued. Deadlines were set. Military plans, prepared years in advance, were suddenly activated. There was no pause to reconsider, no space to slow down. Each move demanded a response, and each response raised the stakes. It was no longer about the assassination. It had become about credibility, power, and the fear of appearing weak. And this is where the chain reaction began, because once one nation moved, others followed. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France aligned with Russia. Britain, watching the balance shift, prepared to enter. What had been a single act of violence was now pulling entire nations into motion, not by accident, but by design. A design built on alliances that left no room for neutrality, no space for hesitation. A system where standing still could mean losing everything. And so within weeks, the situation transformed. Not gradually, but all at once. What began as a regional crisis became a continental war. And from there, it expanded into something even larger. The most unsettling part is not that it happened. It is how quickly it became unstoppable. Because once the first decisions were made, the outcome was no longer controlled by any single leader. The system had taken over, and it was already moving forward. The speed of decisions that outpaced reason. What followed the assassination was not chaos. It was something far more dangerous. Precision. For years, Europe's great powers had been preparing for war in ways that most people never saw. Detailed mobilization plans, railway schedules calculated to the minute, strategies designed to move entire armies across borders with speed and efficiency. These plans were not flexible. They were rigid, mechanical, and once activated, almost impossible to stop. So when the crisis began to unfold, leaders were not making decisions in open space. They were stepping into systems that were already built and already waiting. Germany, fearing encirclement, moved quickly to implement a plan that required immediate action. Russia, unwilling to appear weak, began mobilizing its forces. France prepared in response. Each decision was made under pressure, driven by the belief that delay would mean disadvantage. There was no time to slow down, no time to rethink. Because in this new kind of conflict, hesitation was seen as defeat before the war had even begun. And this created a dangerous momentum. Diplomacy could not keep up with the speed of mobilization. Conversations that once took weeks were now overtaken by actions that unfolded in days. Leaders who might have chosen caution found themselves trapped between options that all carried risk. And so they chose movement. Not because it was the best option, but because it felt like the only option left. This is where reason began to lose its place. Not because leaders stopped thinking, but because the pace of events outstripped their ability to control them. Decisions were no longer about careful calculation. They became reactions, shaped by urgency, fear, and the weight of irreversible plans. And once those plans were set in motion, they did not pause for reconsideration. They advanced, relentlessly. What makes this moment so critical is not just that war began. It is that it began faster than anyone could fully understand. And when decisions move faster than thought, consequences follow a path no one truly intended. When war escaped human control. There is a moment in every conflict when decisions stop shaping events, and events begin to shape decisions. World War I crossed that threshold faster than anyone expected. At the beginning, leaders believed they were directing the war. Strategies were drawn. Objectives were defined. There was still a sense that outcomes could be controlled, that victories could be planned and achieved. But that illusion did not last, because once millions of soldiers were mobilized, once entire economies were redirected toward war, once nations committed everything they had, the conflict stopped being something that could be easily guided. It became a system driven by momentum. Armies advanced not always because it made sense, but because stopping meant losing ground. Battles were fought not always for strategic value, but because the alternative was to admit failure. Resources were consumed at a scale no one had fully anticipated, yet production continued because the war demanded it. And within this system, individuals began to lose influence. Leaders made decisions, but those decisions were increasingly constrained by the reality on the ground. Generals followed plans, but those plans collided with conditions they could not predict. Soldiers fought, but often without understanding why a position had to be taken or retaken again and again. The war no longer belonged to those who started it. It had its own logic, a logic that demanded continuation. This is what makes this stage of the conflict so unsettling. Because once war becomes self-sustaining, it no longer needs justification. It feeds on its own existence. Every loss demands a response. Every sacrifice creates pressure to continue, to make that sacrifice mean something. And so the cycle continues, not because it leads to resolution, but because stopping becomes harder than continuing. At this point, the question is no longer who is winning. It is whether anyone is still in control. And the answer, increasingly, is no. The first war designed for endless stalemate. What happens when a war cannot move forward and cannot end? World War I answered that question in the most brutal way imaginable. By late 1914, the rapid movements that leaders had expected were gone. Armies that had advanced quickly across Europe suddenly stopped, not because they chose to, but because they had no other option. They dug into the ground. Trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, cutting across landscapes that would soon be transformed into something unrecognizable. Mud, wire, craters, and silence filled the space between opposing sides. A narrow strip of land that became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. This was no longer a war of movement. It was a war of position. And in that shift, everything changed. Technology had outpaced strategy. Machine guns could cut down advancing soldiers in seconds. Artillery could destroy entire areas before an attack even began. Defenses had become stronger than offense, and any attempt to break through came at an unimaginable cost. So the war settled into a pattern: attack, loss, retreat, regroup, attack again. The same ground taken and lost over and over, often for no lasting gain. Thousands of lives exchanged for meters of territory that could be lost the next day. And yet, the attacks continued. Because neither side could afford to stop. To stop meant accepting defeat. To stop meant admitting that the sacrifices already made had led nowhere. And so the logic of the system pushed forward, even when progress was impossible. This is what made the stalemate so powerful. It trapped everyone. Leaders could not withdraw. Generals could not change the reality of the battlefield. Soldiers could not escape the cycle they were placed in. And the war itself became something different, not a path to victory, but a condition that sustained itself. A conflict where time did not bring resolution, but repetition, where survival depended not on strategy, but on endurance. And as the months turned into years, a new question began to emerge. If this war cannot be won, why does it continue? The psychological collapse of an entire generation. At first, the war lived in the imagination. It was described as honorable, necessary, even meaningful. Young men marched with a sense of purpose, believing they were stepping into something that would define them, perhaps even elevate them. But the reality they entered was something else entirely. The trenches did not just destroy bodies. They reshaped minds. Days blurred into nights. Noise never stopped. Artillery thundered without warning, tearing the ground apart, shaking the air, breaking any sense of stability. Sleep became uncertain. Fear became constant. And over time, something inside began to change. Soldiers were not only fighting the enemy, they were fighting the environment, the waiting, the repetition, the knowledge that at any moment, everything could end without warning. This created a new kind of damage, not visible, not immediate, but deeply permanent. Men who once believed in progress, in honor, in the direction of history, began to question everything. The war did not feel like purpose. It felt like survival without meaning. Orders were followed, but belief was fading. And when belief fades, something fundamental is lost. This is where the idea of a lost generation begins to take shape. Not just because so many lives were taken, but because those who returned were not the same. They carried with them a silence that could not be easily explained, a distance from the world they had left behind. They had seen something that could not be unseen, a reality where logic breaks down, where progress leads to destruction, where systems built by intelligent minds produce outcomes no one can justify. And this experience did not stay in the trenches. It followed them home, into families, into cities, into culture itself. Art changed, literature changed. The way people understood the world shifted. Certainty was replaced by doubt, confidence by questioning. The belief that humanity was moving forward began to fracture. This was not just the cost of war, it was the transformation of perception. Because once a generation loses its sense of meaning, the world it returns to cannot remain the same. The silent fall of old powers. Empires rarely collapse in a single moment. They weaken quietly from within, long before the world recognizes that they are already falling. World War I did not instantly destroy the great empires of Europe. It exposed the cracks that had been growing for years and accelerated them beyond control. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, vast and diverse, was held together by fragile unity. Different cultures, languages, and identities coexisted under a structure that depended on balance and authority. The war strained that balance until it could no longer hold. The Ottoman Empire, already in decline, entered the conflict with the hope of preserving its remaining power. Instead, it found itself stretched, pressured, and ultimately dismantled. The Russian Empire faced a different kind of collapse. War revealed internal weaknesses that had long been ignored. Economic strain, military failure, and growing dissatisfaction among the population reached a breaking point. What began as pressure turned into revolution, and revolution turned into the end of an entire system of rule. Even Germany, powerful and organized, felt the weight of a conflict that demanded more than it could sustain. The structure remained until the end of the war, but the pressure beneath it was building toward transformation. What makes this collapse so significant is not just that empires fell, it is how they fell. Not through a single decisive blow, but through continuous erosion. Resources depleted, authority questioned, loyalty weakened. The war did not simply defeat these empires on the battlefield. It made their internal instability impossible to ignore. And once that instability becomes visible, it becomes irreversible. Because empires rely on the perception of strength as much as strength itself. When that perception breaks, everything begins to shift. Borders that had existed for generations start to dissolve. Identities begin to change. Power structures that once seemed permanent reveal themselves as temporary. This is where the world begins to transform, not in a dramatic instant, but in a quiet, unfolding collapse that reshapes everything that comes after. The birth of a new type of world order. When the war ended, the world did not return to what it had been. It could not. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. And more importantly, the structures that once held everything together were no longer there. The collapse of empires did not create stability. It created space. And in that space, something new began to form. Nations that had never existed before appeared on the map. Borders were drawn, not by history or identity, but by negotiation, compromise, and in many cases, convenience. Decisions made in rooms far from the people they would affect began to define the future of entire regions. This was not a natural evolution. It was a reconstruction, a deliberate attempt to rebuild order from the aftermath of chaos. But there was a problem. The world that was being created was based on ideals that did not always match reality. Self-determination was promised, but not always delivered. Stability was the goal, but the conditions for instability were already present. The desire to prevent future conflict led to agreements that, instead of resolving tensions, often preserved them in new forms. And at the center of this effort was a belief that a new system could prevent another disaster. That through diplomacy, cooperation, and structure, the world could avoid repeating what had just happened. It was a powerful idea, but it was also fragile, because the same forces that had led to war had not disappeared. They had simply changed shape. National interests remained. Rivalries continued. Economic pressures intensified. And beneath the surface of this new order, old tensions began to reorganize themselves. What emerged was not a stable peace. It was a different kind of balance, one that depended not on the absence of conflict, but on the hope that it could be managed. And hope, without deeper change, is not always enough. This is where the world we recognize today begins to take form, not as a clean break from the past, but as a continuation shaped by new structures, new borders, and unresolved questions that would not remain silent forever. The illusion of victory and the reality of instability. When the war ended, there were winners. But there was no real victory. On paper, the outcome was clear. The Central Powers had been defeated. The Allied nations stood on the side of success. The conflict had reached its conclusion, and the world expected closure. But beneath that surface, something was wrong. Because the end of the war did not feel like resolution. It felt like exhaustion. Entire nations were drained. Economies were weakened. Societies were fractured. The cost had been so high that even those who had won struggled to define what they had gained. And yet, decisions still had to be made. The most important of those decisions came in the form of the Treaty of Versailles, an agreement designed to establish peace, but shaped by pressure, fear, and the desire for accountability. Germany was held responsible. Reparations were imposed. Restrictions were enforced. From one perspective, it was justice. From another, it was imbalance. Because instead of stabilizing the situation, these decisions introduced new tensions. Economic strain deepened. Resentment grew. A sense of humiliation took hold among those who felt punished beyond repair. And this is where the illusion becomes clear. Victory suggested that the conflict had been resolved, but the conditions created in its aftermath ensured that the consequences would continue. Not immediately, not visibly, but steadily. Because instability does not always appear as chaos. Sometimes it develops quietly, through frustration, through imbalance, through the accumulation of unresolved pressure. This is what makes this moment so critical. The war had ended, but the environment it left behind was not stable. It was fragile, uncertain, and already beginning to shift in ways that would not be fully understood until much later. And that raises a question that lingers beneath the surface. If victory does not bring stability, then what exactly did the world achieve? The invisible consequences that spread across decades. When the war ended, the destruction was visible. Cities damaged, economies strained, lives lost. But the most powerful consequences were not the ones people could see. They were the ones that unfolded slowly, across years, across decades, across entire societies that were trying to rebuild without fully understanding what had changed within them. The global economy did not recover evenly. Some nations struggled under the weight of debt and reparations. Others tried to stabilize, but the balance was fragile. Markets became unpredictable. Trust weakened. And beneath it all, a sense of uncertainty began to shape decisions at every level. This uncertainty did not stay confined to economics. It spread into politics. Governments that once seemed stable began to face pressure. New ideologies emerged, offering simple answers to complex problems. Some promised strength, others promised order. Many gained support not because they were fully understood, but because people were searching for something to hold on to. And when uncertainty meets desperation, change accelerates. Social structures began to shift. Old hierarchies were questioned. New movements formed. The world was not just rebuilding physically. It was redefining itself, often without a clear direction. What makes these consequences so difficult to recognize is their nature. They do not announce themselves. They grow. Quietly, gradually, until they reach a point where their impact becomes undeniable. By the time that happens, they are no longer consequences. They are new realities. This is what World War I truly set in motion. Not just immediate change, but long-term transformation. A series of developments that would continue to evolve, shaping decisions, influencing events, and creating conditions that extended far beyond the years of the war itself. And as these changes accumulated, something else began to form. A pattern. One that suggested the story of this war was not yet complete. The war that never truly ended. There is a tendency to think of history as something that closes. A beginning, a middle, an end. But some events do not follow that structure. They continue. Not through battles or armies, but through consequences that never fully disappear. World War I is one of those events. Because even after the fighting stopped, even after treaties were signed and borders were redrawn, the world did not return to a state of stability. It moved forward carrying the weight of everything that had happened, and that weight shaped what came next. The political tensions that followed did not emerge from nowhere. The economic instability that spread across nations was not an isolated development. The rise of new conflicts, new ideologies, and new forms of power were not disconnected events. They were continuations. What began in 1914 did not remain confined to those years. It extended into the decades that followed, influencing decisions, creating conditions, and setting the stage for events that would once again reshape the world. The next global conflict did not appear as a separate chapter. It emerged from the unresolved consequences of the first. And even beyond that, the impact continues. The borders drawn, the systems created, the shifts in power that occurred during and after the war still define much of the modern world. The way nations interact, the way conflicts develop, the way global stability is understood, all carry traces of what happened during that period. This is what makes this story different. It is not just about the past, it is about the present. Because when an event changes the structure of the world, it does not end when the event itself ends. It becomes part of the foundation on which everything else is built, and that leads to a realization that is difficult to ignore. We do not study this war simply because it happened. We study it because in many ways it is still happening, not in the form of trenches or battles, but in the consequences that continue to shape the world we live in today.